Last week, I talked about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. This week, I'm back to talk about the sequel, Through the Looking Glass. Now, in my video for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which I'll link to in the description down below, I complained a bit about how I didn't like stories that were all somebody's dream. For a couple of reasons. One, at the end, you find out it was all meaningless. None of it actually happened. But two, with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, sometimes even within the story itself, you get hints that there are no stakes or no logical progressions. Alice will seem to fade in and out of different realities. I mention that because that is true more so in Through the Looking Glass. Through the Looking Glass, if I suspect everybody knows the premise behind this, but it's the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, in which Alice goes through the mirror, or through the looking glass, as I guess it was apparently known back in those days, to enter another fantastic land, which is essentially the same as Wonderland. Well, I'll talk about a few differences in a moment, but essentially the same as Wonderland. So lots of fantastic creatures, nothing makes sense, all the characters talk in riddles. It's essentially Wonderland, but it leans, the story is leaning even more heavily on the surrealism of dreams, where Alice is abruptly transported in and out of different realities. So, for example, she is on the chessboard here. The chessboard is like the countryside divided into squares by hedges and rivers. And then, while crossing a river, all of a sudden, she magically finds herself transported into a train where there are a whole bunch of talking animals in the carriage with her and a conductor who's very upset that she doesn't have a ticket. And then while she's talking with them, then all of a sudden she is magically transported beneath a tree in the forest where she is talking with a gnat who had been on the tree with her. Or to give another example here, Alice is comforting the White Queen, and then the White Queen starts talking about how everything is better, and then she starts saying it like better, 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 and then she starts bawling like a sheep, and then all of a sudden Alice realizes that she is in a shop where the sheep is behind the counter. And while Alice is looking around at the shop, all of a sudden, she finds herself in a rowboat. The shop transforms into a rowboat, and all of a sudden, Alice is rowing through the river and looking out from some rushes. And then all of a sudden, she finds herself back in the shop, and she's going to get an egg at the end of the shop. But as she's walking towards the egg, then it turns into Humpty Dumpty. So you see what I mean? It's even more so than the previous book. It's a book where the reality of any given moment is just likely to morph into something else without any explanation. The explanation, of course, is that it's all a dream. Now, that's not technically revealed until the very end, when Alice wakes up and she realizes that the queen she has been shaking is really a kitty. But we all knew it was all a dream anyways, right? Because we've all read the first Alice in Wonderland. So we knew that the first magical land was just all a dream. So, I mean, if you didn't guess it, if you couldn't guess it while you were reading it, yeah, you definitely know because you already finished it. So now with Through the Looking Glass, I think what's going on is Lewis Carroll is not even trying to hide that this is all a dream, and he's leaning very hard into the surreal element of it. Which, I'll be honest, didn't always do it for me. I mean, when I was reading about the queen, and then all of a sudden the queen was a sheep, and then the sheep was minding the shop, but then all of a sudden the shop was a river, and I'm like, what am I reading? Like this is just so strange and random. That there's no stakes or story to get invested in. So that's me complaining about this book, but there is another side to it, and this is something that I really I should have said this in my video last week on Alice in Wonderland, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I regret that I didn't remember to say that, but I'll say it here. It is so readable. So, like, these past 2 weeks, well, I've been working through this book. Whenever I wanted some really light reading, whenever I just wanted to sit on the couch and relax for a few moments, whenever I wanted something that was very easy and undemanding, I reached for this book, and finished it off within a few days. That's good for me. I'm a slow reader. Because for all its faults, it is just so readable. And it's very episodic, but to a certain extent, that makes it easy to read. It reminds me almost of like, television. Something designed for people with short attention spans, like Family Guy with all the cutaway gags, or a sketch comedy show where they're constantly just jumping from one situation to another, or maybe like Monty Python would I know that's a little bit of an older example, but that's maybe a perfect example where they don't really cut from one scene to another, as one scene will just kind of morph into another in a lot of their episodes. So in that respect, it feels quite modern. It feels like it was designed for an audience with short attention spans. And I guess it was designed for children, wasn't it? But usually, even children's books from the Victorian era assume a different pacing and attention span. This one, the individual episodes are just so short that if you don't like the situation, or if you're not engaged with whatever is going on, then just wait a couple pages, because it'll morph into something completely different. And if you have like if you're trying to keep track of the linear progression of the plot, it'll drive you crazy. But if you're just casually reading it, there's so much variety here to keep you interested. That plus the illustrations. Now, the illustrations in this book are by John Tinnell, who was the original illustrator. He's the guy that collaborated with Lewis Carroll to illustrate this book back when it was first published in... When was this first published? I don't know. Sometime in the 19th century. In most editions, I think, will reproduce those original illustrations, and they're quite good. Nowadays they might be published in color. They didn't have... Well, actually, did they have color illustrations back then? I don't know, but at any rate, in this edition, they are black and white. But these illustrations just make the story pop, and they're on pretty much every page. Or maybe you'll go, okay, here's a page without illustrations, but then turn the page and then here's another illustration. So they're on just about every spread, or maybe every other spread. And between those illustrations, which just make the story pop out at you, and the quick pace through which Alice jumps through any given situation, it's just so painless and easy to read, even in this modern era. There are a couple situations which maybe go on for a few beats too long. Maybe similar to a sketch comedy show where there's one or two sketches that go on for a little bit too long. But on the whole, it's just it's just really fun to read for all its faults. So I would recommend it for that. Okay. So this book, Alice goes through the looking glass, and it's basically the same as Alice in Wonderland, but there are a couple different motifs. One is everything is backwards in Looking Glass Land, just like everything is reversed as you see it in a mirror. There's even like she picks up something to read, and let's see, is this going to focus in on the camera? The Jabberwocky poem is originally. I don't think this camera is going to focus in on it. The Jabberwocky poem is originally written backwards. Now, because my camera shows everything in mirror image, if I try and focus it on here, the Jabberwocky poem is probably going to be the only thing that is showing the right way, and the rest of this is showing in mirror image. But then the other thing is there's a chess theme. So the original Alice's in Wonderland was, as you know, focused on a playing card theme. So here's an illustration from Alice in Wonderland where there are playing cards. But Alice Through the Looking Glass has all the chess pieces. Instead of playing cards, it's now chess pieces. And Alice herself, when she goes to the top of the hill, sees that the whole countryside is laid out in squares, bisected by hedges and rivers. And so she's got to go across this chessboard, and she's a pawn, and if she gets to the end, she becomes a queen. Now, because the reality in this dream is constantly morphing from one thing to another, she'll start off on the chessboard, and then she'll go a few squares, and then she'll end up in some different fantasy, and then it'll morph back into something else. So it's not strictly chess all the time, but that's the overall metaphor for this book. And there's actually a chess problem at the very beginning of the book that tries to, I think what this does is explain where all the pieces are moving throughout the story, and with the page numbers that correspond to their moves. I've actually not worked this out. I mean, I think you need a chess set to move the pieces and work it out. Or Wikipedia actually has a little animation of where the chess pieces are moving. So you could look at that, but I didn't really have the patience to sit down and make sure everything worked out. I'm just going to take the author's word and Wikipedia's word that it all works out. But as she's going through the various chessboards, the other theme that pops up here is nursery rhymes. So she encounters a lot of nursery rhyme characters. For example, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, who she meets. Now, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, again, you're probably familiar with them. They were in the Disney movie, for example, Alice in Wonderland. They're actually in the book Through the Looking Glass, but they were in the movie Alice in Wonderland, because I think it's quite common that the Disney movie and a lot of these movie adaptations will simply mesh the elements from both books. So, like a lot of people, I have known Tweedledum and Tweedledee for my entire life from the Disney cartoon. And vaguely knew it was associated with the Alice in Wonderland stories. And I never knew that Tweedledum and Tweedledee came from a nursery rhyme. Because as soon as Alice meets them, she recites a nursery rhyme in which she knows them from. And the nursery rhyme goes like this. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle. For Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow, as black as tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so, they forgot their quarrel. I guess barrel and quarrel would maybe rhyme in some dialect of English. Now, Lewis Carroll, of course, makes up a lot of his own poems for these stories. So when I read that, I'm like, okay, is that a real nursery rhyme or is that something Lewis Carroll made up? So I Googled it, went to Wikipedia, and it turns out it's a real nursery rhyme that was originally the origin of these characters. So I wonder how many people out there knew about the Tweedledum and Tweedledee nursery rhyme. Is it just me? Is it one of these things that's more popular in England than it is in America? Because I know sometimes the canon of nursery rhymes differs a little bit between the two countries. But at any rate, Alice sees them, and she knows the nursery rhyme, so she knows what's going to happen. But instead, they waste her time for several pages talking about the walrus and the carpenter, which is a poem that Lewis Carroll has completely made up, that Tweedledum and Tweedledee recite. And then they see a sleeping king, and they talk about whether the king is dreaming, and if he's dreaming, maybe they are all characters in his dream, and if he wakes up, then that's going to be the end of them. And Alice, of course, rejects that view of reality, but it's a funny discussion nonetheless. And then after all that, then all of a sudden, the part about the rattle comes up. And it's a little bit funny because you're not expecting it. You've completely forgotten about this rattle because all this other stuff is going on. So yeah, reading here. So they're arguing about the umbrella. Alice is just about to leave, and then Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella and seized her by the wrist. "Do you see that?" he said in a voice choking with passion, and his eyes grew large and yellow all in a moment, as he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing laying under the tree. "It's only a rattle," Alice said after a careful examination of the little white thing. "Not a rattlesnake, you know," she added hastily, thinking that he was frightened. "Only an old rattle, quite old and broken." "I know it was," cried Tweedledum, beginning to stamp about wildly and tear his hair. "It's spoilt, of course." Here he looked at Tweedledee, who immediately sat down on the ground and tried to hide himself under the umbrella. Alice laid her hand upon his arm and said in a soothing tone, "You needn't be so angry about an old rattle." "But it isn't old," Tweedledum cried in a greater fury than ever. "It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday. My nice, new rattle!" And his voice rose to a perfect scream. And here's a picture. All this time, Tweedledee was trying his best to fold up the umbrella with himself in it, which was such an extraordinary thing to do that it quite took off Alice's attention from the angry brother. But he couldn't succeed, and it ended in his rolling over, bundling up in the umbrella with only his head out, and there he lay, opening and shutting his mouth and his large eyes, looking more like a fish than anything else, Alice thought. "Of course, you agreed to have a battle?" Tweedledum said in a calmer tone. "I suppose so," the other sulkily replied. So now they're going to do their battle, just like in the nursery rhyme, and Alice is helping them get on all their things. And then Alice is like, oh, when is that crow going to get here, right? Because there's a crow in the original nursery rhyme. And then a similar thing happens later when she meets Humpty Dumpty. Now, Alice again knows the nursery rhyme. So she knows that Humpty Dumpty is going to fall off the wall. And she keeps trying to warn him. And all the time, he's always on the verge of falling off. But, he's so pretentious. He's so sure that he's not going to fall off. And he says, it doesn't matter anyways, because the king has assured me that if I ever fall off of this wall, he's going to send all of his soldiers and all of his men. Sorry, all of his horses and all of his men to help me. Alice talks to Humpty Dumpty for several pages. Humpty Dumpty is telling all these ridiculous stories. And then she walks away just as he falls off. And then there's the Lion and the Unicorn. Now, the Lion and the Unicorn is, I believe, a poem that is much more famous in England than it is in the United States. Again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm an American myself, but I want to be careful about overgeneralizing about my own personal childhood experience to talk about all Americans. But speaking for myself, I never heard about it until I was like, I think in my 30s. And the first time I heard about it was in connection with a George Orwell essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, which I didn't realize at the time was going back to this old nursery rhyme. But the old nursery rhyme goes, the lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all around the town. Some gave them plum cake some gave them white bread and some gave them brown, and some gave them plum cake and drummed them out of town. So, it's another nonsensical nursery rhyme, but it gets enacted out here with them fighting, and then they give them the bread, and then they stop to give them the cake. Yeah. And they talked about how they were, the lion beat the unicorn all around the town. Here the king interrupted to prevent the quarrel going on. He was nervous and his voice quite quivered. All around the town, he said. That's a good long way. Did you go by the old bridge or the marketplace? You get the best view by the old bridge. I'm sure I don't know, the lion growled as he lay down again. There was too much dust to see anything. What a time the monster is, cutting up that cake. They take a break for the cake here, and the lion says, then hand round the plum cake, monster. Monster is what they call Alice, the lion said, lying down and putting his chin on his paws. And sit down, both of you, to the king and the unicorn. Fair play with the cake, and then, of course, then they get drummed out of town. So they take the nursery rhyme and then just... everything just gets enacted out with Alice knowing what's going to be enacted out, and the whole thing I found quite silly and clever and funny, and I enjoyed it. What else is there to talk about? Oh, the Mad Hatter is back in this book, kind of. Now this is one of those things that I think you don't really fully appreciate unless you have the illustrations. So the queen is talking about how the king's messenger is locked up in the dungeon. And then there's a picture of it here. And you can see from the picture that this is actually the Mad Hatter. He's not called Hatter. But then later on, there are two messengers of the king. And one is Hatta. It's Haighi, And the note says he pronounced it as to rhyme with mayor. But this is the English pronunciation. So the English, of course, don't pronounce the R's at the end of words. So it's not hair, it's hea or mea. And then the Hatter is known as Hatta. So I think this is a pun on the spelling that works much better in the British English pronunciation. Now, yeah. Where's a picture of the March hare? You can see them, yeah. Here he is as one of the king's messengers, and here's Hatta and Hea here with the king, with the lion and the unicorn are fighting around. Now, Alice never recognizes them. Alice never says, I recognize you. You're the Mad Hatter. And it's not Wonderland. It's a different place. So it's left a little bit ambiguous as to are these the same characters or not. But I mean, come on, it's the same characters. I mean, those pictures are dead giveaways, huh? Yeah, and then, oh right. Other things to talk about here. There's a few famous poems within the story. As within the original Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll is inserting poems in here. One is Jabberwocky, which is a poem you've probably heard of. You may well have heard of it outside of this book because it's I think it's famous now in its own right. This is the Jabberwocky here. So it says, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toes did gile and gimber in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and mum ras outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the frumerous Bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time Maxoming foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood a while in thought," etc. And it goes on for a few more stanzas after that. But you know, if you watch this channel, you know that I quite frequently talk about books on linguistics. And the Jabberwocky pops up in a lot of the books on linguistics as an example of something that follows the rules of English syntax, but inserts nonsense words in there. And the point that most books make on this is that you can, even though you have no idea what vorpal is, when it says he took his vorpal sword in hand, even though it's a completely made up word, you know it's an adjective just from the syntax. Yeah, so many books on linguistics I have read use the Jabberwocky as an illustration of how you can put nonsense words into English grammar, and it still makes sense, or at least it still sounds like something makes sense, because your brain is recognizing the syntax as being English syntax, even though the words are completely meaningless. And then after Alice reads this poem, she says to herself, "Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't exactly know what they are. However, somebody killed something. That's clear at any rate." Linguists love Lewis Carroll. His stuff always seems to pop up in books on linguistics. The other scene from this book that quite frequently pops up in linguistics is when Alice is talking to Humpty Dumpty. And Humpty Dumpty is using words in an unorthodox way. And Alice says, well, that's not what the word means. And Humpty Dumpty says, well, it is what it means when I say it. When I say a word, it means exactly what I want it to mean. So that obviously opens up the whole field of semantics and how do words get their meaning, and how do we agree upon what words have their meaning. Another thing that linguists love to talk about. So in the books on linguistics I read, they will quite frequently cite the Humpty Dumpty scene as well. Okay, I think I've rambled on long enough about this, so I'm going to just leave off here. So to summarize, a very strange book, to be sure, but interesting. Fun to read. In spite of everything, it's fun to read and easy to read. And the pictures are a lot of fun. And, I figure Lewis Carroll is a little bit like reading Shakespeare because everybody quotes Lewis Carroll. So when you're reading him, you're constantly like, that's where that comes from. I heard that quote before, like cabbages and kings, right? You've heard that before. That comes from a poem in the Looking Glass. All these things that you never realized were from this book. As you're reading it, you're constantly catching the references. So it worth reading for that reason, if for no other.